right, folks, I want to talk a little bit more about slavery. It's important that you pay attention at this point because this is an awful subject. It's a terrible subject. Slavery is obviously a bad idea. It's a terrible thing. It's not fair. But what we're looking at is the way it exists at this particular point. Once we cut off the international slave trade, what we're going to look at is a migration of slaves from the north to the south. They're going to be sold down the river. The idea being is they're being sold down to Mississippi. They're being sold down to Missouri. They're going by the steamboat full. Abe Lincoln, before he was president, he remembers seeing a coffle of slaves, which means a group of slaves joined by neck manacles, neck collars, and chains between the two, and they were kept on board the steamboat out on the deck with the rest of the property that was being shipped, with the rest of the cotton. And that was one of his first face-to-face views of slavery. So as we look at this sale south, I want you to realize that cash crops, thanks to Eli Whitney, cotton is so much more productive, cotton is so much more beneficial, cotton is so much more profitable that there's going to be a boom in slavery. Where it was phasing out, when he reinvents or innovates the cotton gin, he makes cotton much more profitable. And so slavery is going to boom. Since they can't bring in more slaves, they're going to buy the slaves out of the North. And the North is going to be fine with this. Yes, we don't believe in slavery. So rather than set them free, since they think slavery is wrong, they're going to sell them down the river. This is different. The way slavery used to happen is what would happen is they would bring the slaves in from Africa. They would bring them usually to the Caribbean first. They would stop at some of the farms there, and the slaves from the boats would be introduced to the slaves in the farms, the slaves on the plantations there for a period of what we call seasoning. And seasoning was allowing the slaves to adapt, taking these new slaves, introducing them to the old slaves. They could learn the language, they could learn the ideas, they could learn their place. They would also be subjected to some of those new European diseases. The idea being that they could get sick now, they could build up an immunity, and by the time they got to where they were going, that they would be healthy and they would be acclimated. Part of that acclimation is going to be learning what it is they're supposed to do, okay? Learning their place, learning their relationship. One of the things that comes out of this is what we call fictive kin. If you're raised in the South, you might have a lot of aunts and uncles. I had a lot of aunts and uncles growing up. Turns out I wasn't related to them. They were what they call fictive kin. So Aunt so-and-so or Uncle so-and-so was actually just a friend of the family. Well, fictive kin comes in at this particular point because these slaves that are coming in don't, for the most part, have relatives, but they're going to go ahead and develop relatives. They're going to go ahead and develop a relationship because it helps them to adapt. It helps them to learn. Well, from this seasoning process, and what's going to happen normally is they would work on getting them healthy. They would work on fattening them up before they go ahead and put them on the auction block. And the auction block, they used to call it the scramble, because what they would do is all the slaves would scramble off of the ship and onto the block, and they would be fattened up, and they would parade them out there for the people to see, let them look at their teeth, let them look at all the things that they thought were necessary on whether or not they were going to be a good product. And then they would go ahead and sell them off. You have to realize that there are a lot of levels of slavery. One of the things the book notes that takes place, especially around New Orleans, is slaves for the fancy trade. And the fancy trade, folks, is, well, what we're looking at is sexual slavery at that particular point. Is you're selling saloon girls, you're selling girls that are going to work in the sex trade at that particular point. And the idea being is that's what they're being hired out to do. That's what's going to happen. But there's a lot of different variations of slavery. Well, once we stop the international slave trade, there is going to be or happen a shortage of slaves, or there should be, since we're not supplying new ones. But what's going to happen is we're going to look at something called natural increase. When you're bringing the slaves from the north down to the south, what's going to happen is the Southerners, the Southern slave owners are going to get a little bit different idea. They're going to realize that if they treat the slaves a little bit better, because the slaves are an investment, if they feed them a little bit better, if they go ahead, and I'm not saying they're nice, I'm not saying they're nurturing. What they're doing is they're realizing that this is an investment. It's a long-term investment. So they encourage the slaves to develop a life. They encourage the slaves to develop a family. What they want is the slaves to be happy enough to reproduce. And that's what natural increase is reproducing. Whether it is forced, whether it is voluntary, the idea is they want the slaves to go ahead and have children. So the pregnant slaves don't have to work as much. The pregnant slaves, when they give birth, have a little bit of a decrease in what they have to do as long as the baby is young, until eventually they're out of that stage. And this is what we're looking at this point, is we're looking at where the slave trade becomes more of a business. The idea of managing your slaves, the idea of managing their increase becomes a business. The book has a term, I noted, it's got mulattoes in there. And mulattoes are significant because we have some owners who decide, you know what, I want the slaves to have children. There's not enough male slaves to go ahead and take care of the female slaves. And so the owners are going to decide that they're going to go ahead and sleep with, yes, to have sex with the female slaves in order to impregnate them. Because as far as they're concerned, it's going to go with what the slave code says. And we've already read the Virginia slave code a few chapters back, that the child go ahead, it takes the same space as the mother. So a child, even though the father might be free, the child's going to be a slave because the mom was a slave. This is how we go ahead and we increase slaves. This is how we go ahead and we benefit from this change in the slave trade. Well, you got to realize a couple of things. Farther down that list, you start to look at Gabriel Prosser, you start to look at Charles Deslandis, you start to look at Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey. We're going to have an abundance, I won't say educated slaves, but let's say more aware slaves, because of their contact with the North, because of their contact. Some are going to learn to read, some are going to learn to write, some are going to become a bit more educated and realize that life is not equal. And so what we're going to have is an uprising of slave rebellions. And the slave rebellions are important because it's going to change the tenure of slaves themselves. And you have to realize that this increase, the increase in work, the increase in concentrations in the slaves is going to reflect in a way that some of these slaves are going to demand their freedom. They're going to rebel. In the case of Nat Turner, we know that it's a bloody rebellion. Denmark Vesey doesn't actually get to stage his, but Gabriel Prosser does. And what will happen is this is going to be a clamping down in the South. This is where we're going to get more slave codes in, and they're going to go ahead and further restrict what slaves can and can't do. And so this is a change in the dynamic, and you have to be aware that this change in the dynamic is going to cue a whole different relationship of slaves in the South versus the way slavery is due in the North. The Southerners are going to start claiming that benevolent paternalism that I talked about before. That's like, listen, we're trying to lift these people up. We're trying to help these people. We're trying to treat them like family. They're also trying to justify slavery. They justify slavery by citing the Bible. It's like, look, in the Bible, Jacob had a slave, and if it's okay in the Bible, then it should be okay now. And so they do a lot of things. We change the dynamic and the discussion of slavery at this point. All right. That's it for now. I'll go ahead and I'll pick up in the next chapter when I get started. Make sure you get the reading done and don't forget to get stuff turned in. Take care.